Hi, this is Daniela Cambone, and welcome back to Stansberry Research. My guest today is a lawyer, an economist, an investment banker, and a multiple New York Times best-selling author. He's also one of our favorites whenever he comes on our show. It's always great to speak with him. Please welcome back Jim Rickards. Jim, always good to be with you. Nice to see you.
Thank you, Danielle. Great to be with you.
So, if I have your blessing, Jim, there's two different topics I want to cover with you today. So this will be a part one and a part two. Part one, I'd like to begin with your recent thoughts on Russia, and then part two for the folks at home, we will be tackling the issue of inflation. But I'd like to start by getting your thoughts, obviously, on Russia and Ukraine, and something that you recently wrote, that what happens in Russia doesn't stay in Russia. Russia may be the first victim of U.S. sanctions, but the entire world will pay the final price. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, so that's kind of where I wanted to start with you today, is that the buck doesn't stop here, right? These are repercussions that will be felt for how many years, Jim?
Well, the repercussions may be felt for 10 years or longer, but the immediate impact is going to go well beyond the so-called sanctions. What the point I was really making was we're slapping sanctions on Russia. Russia is hitting back with some retaliatory actions, and it's pretty easy to look at the direct impact of that. But there's second order and third order effects that will pop up all over the world and could very quickly get out of control. Think of it as the economic equivalent of a nuclear war. Nobody wants a nuclear war, but I studied a nuclear war fighting actually in the beginning of the late 1960s with Herman Kahn, Henry Kissinger, the Wallstetter, the leading scholars of the time. And they had different theoretical views. A lot of it was game theoretic. Fortunately, we didn't actually have a nuclear war. But the one thing they all said in common, the one thing they all shared was don't go there. And what they meant was that nobody wakes up and says, oh, gee, I think I'll start a nuclear war today. What a good idea. That never happens. What does happen is you get into an escalatory situation, back and forth, where you're escalating and escalating, and you end up in a nuclear war. You never intended it, never started out that way, but you end up there through escalation. Now take that, and that is good analysis. Take that and apply it to what is now, I would say, the first full-scale economic war, sanctions war. We've had sanctions, for a long time. I mean, going back to at least the 70s with Iran, but even before that, I mean, FDR put sanctions on Japan in August 1941, and then 5 months later they bombed Pearl Harbor. So the not coincidence, but the coexistence or interaction of economic sanctions and kinetic warfare is nothing new. So we've had it before. Nothing on this scale. This is unprecedented in its scope and application. And my only point is the effects of this are going to not just last a long time, yes, but they're going to pop up in very, very unexpected places. And Danielle, one thing quickly before we jump into this, obviously, economic sanctions, economic warfare are among my areas of expertise. I've done a lot of it for years, but I do a seminar for kind of mid-career big thinkers in the military run by the U.S. Army War College, but involves our branch, and I teach the seminar in financial warfare. So it's kind of my topic, but I don't want to, overlook the human tragedy and the human cost and the civilian casualties from what's going on in Ukraine. So when I talk about economic effects, I'm not either unaware of that or unsympathetic. We certainly all pray for the victims of this, but that's on the news every night. We get enough of that, but I don't think the economic side of it, which is our subject, is not that well understood.
Yeah, and you're right. Or oftentimes it's just kind of brushed aside like, oh, there's economic sanctions, and we don't really understand what that really means. But before we unpack that and really go and take a deep dive there, the beauty of Twitter is that you can look back in history. And there's a tweet of yours that came up from 2015, Jim, because you're talking about how these things don't brew overnight. And back in 2015, this is the soothsayer that you are, you had written or tweeted, Russia is arming Ukraine rebels and U.S. is preparing to arm Kiev. So we'll have a nice little U.S.-Russia proxy war soon, just like #Vietnam. Did you expect anything like this?
I did. Let me make the point. This was there was never a war that was easier to prevent. There's never been a war that's easier to prevent. and there's never been a war that's easier to end. You could end this war in 48 hours or less. Having said that, I did expect that through a series of policy blunders and escalation, in this case, military escalation and political escalation, that this war would take place. And thank you for mentioning that, Danielle. That's from 2015. Go back to 2011, my first book, Currency Wars. The first two chapters of that are an economic war game. And then later in the book, around on page 250 or so, I have a whole section on Ukraine, Russia, and natural gas. So this has been brewing for a long time. You can go back to the 2008 Bucharest Declaration, but if you want to pick one thing, say, hey, when did this thing take a turn for the worse,
Right.
so that we were on a path to war? That was the color revolution sponsored by Obama and Biden, which was a coup d'etat. I mean, the president of Ukraine at the time, he was pro-Russian. He was nobody's idea of a nice guy, but he was duly elected. They had a democracy, and he was elected, and he had the the plurality and a coalition in the parliament. And Obama set out to depose him, and they did. And they put in Poroshenko, who was a U.S. puppet. And at the same time, like 2 months after the color revolution, 1 month before Poroshenko, Putin took Crimea. He said, "Okay, that's how you want to play. Fine. You move away from neutrality, move towards NATO. I'll take Crimea. Your move." And then there was nothing. Putin didn't take 1 square inch during the Trump administration, because Trump is highly unpredictable. But put Biden back in, who was part of the original Obama-Biden team, and here we are again. So you could easily see this coming.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that I want to get back to. If the Russians had, the propaganda to put Trump in power, why wouldn't he have done it under Trump?
Because they didn't have the propaganda to put Trump in power. That was a lie concocted by Hillary Clinton, pursued by the Democratic National Committee. And, if I'd said that, well, I did say that 6 years ago, but when you said it 6 years ago, you were disregarded as a kook. But now, through multiple investigations, reports, that information is out there. In fact, it's worse than that. Not only was the Trump-Russia, collusion hoax, which has been thoroughly looked at by congressional committees, the Department of Justice Inspector General, the Mueller Commission, everybody looked at it, bipartisan, independent, all said the same thing. It was a hoax. It was a fake dossier. It never happened. So not only was Trump not in Putin's pocket, he was the only one who stood up to Putin in such a way that Putin didn't take 1 square inch of territory. He took Crimea under Obama. Now he's taking kind of half the country under Biden. Didn't take anything under Trump. So that completely debunks that. But just to take it one step further, who is in the pocket of the Ukrainians, at least? And the answer is Joe Biden, because of Hunter Biden, who made millions of dollars from Burisma, their large natural gas company. Ukraine is ranked in the low 90s of the most corrupt countries in the world. In other words, it's at the bottom on a corruption list, with the most honest countries being on top. Ukraine is very close to the bottom. It's the most corrupt country in Europe, one of the most corrupt countries in the world. Zelensky is just another oligarch, just another phony. And he just banished 11 political parties that make up the rest of the parliament. He banned all their parties, arrested some of their leaders, took over the state media. He's got tens of millions, if not more, stashed away in the bank. So he's another corrupt. This thing about Zelensky's the new Churchill. I mean, give me a break. He's one of the most corrupt officials around. Just another oligarch. Now you can take sides, but to me, Putin's a dictator. Zelensky's a dictator. Pick your dictator. But this idea that he's some good guy Democrat is nonsense.
I want to get back to your point when you said this war could be over in 48 hours. How would that play out for you?
Well, it's a phone call, basically. I mean, Biden's kind of non-compos mentis, but somebody who can string a few sentences together needs to call Zelensky and say, here's what we're going to do. You're not going to join NATO. We'll get the NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, to say that. You need to say it, and the U.S. will say it. So you're not going to join NATO. You're not going to join the EU. You can be independent in the sense of being autonomous, but you have to be neutral. And there are plenty of models for this. Finland during the Cold War, Austria during the Cold War, potentially Ukraine today. When you've got two great powers, whether it's the U.S. and Russia or the U.S. plus Europe and Russia confronting each other. The idea of buffer states, I mean, that's as old as, maybe if not history, at least the history of buffer states is several centuries old at this point. It's a part of what every international strategist looks at. So Ukraine should be a buffer state. It should be neutral. That way Putin has no reason to invade, and we have no reason to try to push the borders of NATO to a point slightly east of Moscow, which Moscow hasn't been attacked from the east since Genghis Khan.
Let's talk about the economic war once the kinetic war, as you say, is over. And, you say Russia is not a punching bag that takes hits without hitting back. You cite, for example, Russia will be teaming up with China to roll out the Chinese credit card system for Russian consumers. This comes after Visa and MasterCard ended all business with Russia. Their efforts won't end there. So let's start with that. How we might see this power play emerge between China and Russia, or this teaming up, this partnership.
Right. Well, let's start with the sanctions and then pivot over to how China can replace a lot of other points of contact in terms of the Russian economy. These sanctions will not work to stop the war or slow the war or change the outcome of the war. Now, they absolutely punish the Russian economy. Yep. They punish Russian individuals, consumers, Russian citizens. They're going to have fewer options, more expensive goods. Their economy is going to slow down. Unemployment will go up. The ruble is devalued. All those things are true. But they're also true in the United States. We're going to punish Americans far worse than the Russians. We're already seeing, I took a long trip yesterday. I filled up my car with gas at the end of the trip. It was $76. It used to be $45 to fill up my car. Now it's $76. Yeah. Not quite doubling. Well, multiply that by 200 million cars and every consumer in the United States and elsewhere in the world. You're seeing the impact of this already. It's not like, oh, gee, it's coming. It's already here. It's going to get a lot worse. And when I say a lot worse, I'm not just talking about prices in the grocery store, which are going to go up a lot. They have gone up already. I mean, the inflation's already here. Watch what's going to happen. Ukraine's kind of one of their nicknames is the breadbasket of Europe. They provide about, Russia and Ukraine together provide about 25% of the grain exports in the world. Pick your country, but when you get to Africa, there are countries in Africa where they get almost 100% of their grain from Ukraine. Lebanon gets 100% of its grain from Ukraine. Those people are going to starve because the Russians have taken over the Sea of Azov. They're working on the Black Sea ports. Odessa's the big one that's left, but Odessa's in their sights. That'll be a month to 6 weeks away because they got to finish up Mariupol and connect the line from Kharkiv to Donetsk and then extend through Crimea. So they have a lot of work to do in the south and the east to consolidate that. But then they'll turn and Kiev's last. Everyone's like, oh, gee, Putin had a 3-day blitzkrieg in Kiev and they didn't do it, so he's failed. That's not true. Where did that come from? That's a Western propaganda narrative to set up Putin as a failure. That was never Putin's plan. Have you seen the Russian battle plans? I haven't, but I know what they're doing just by looking at their operations. Kiev is last on the list. They want to get Odessa first, but when they do, and this may already be the case because the Russian Navy is in the Black Sea, there are not going to be any exports from Ukraine, and the U.S. has banned most exports from Russia. And Russia has retaliated by saying, we're not going to export you anyway, even if you didn't have a ban. You're on our banned list. But you take 25% of the world's grain exports off the market. Tell me what that does to the price of wheat. And by the way, wheat's not just a loaf of bread. Most grain is used to feed livestock. So it goes straight through the price of pork, chicken, beef, etc. You're looking at things doubling or more. And then that's if you can get it. Then behind that are shortages. Now, we had a supply chain breakdown before any of this started. The supply chain has been breaking down in stages over the last several years. That became acute last fall. And everyone's like, oh, well, yeah, give it a month, they'll sort things out. No, it's getting worse. And now you put the Ukraine war on top of that and the economic sanctions on top of that, it's going to get a lot worse. So, those are some of the economic effects. And those are the easy ones. I'll give you an example of a more difficult one. So, we kicked Russia and their 10 biggest banks out of SWIFT. That's what that is. That's the worldwide banking telecommunications facility. So you can't use SWIFT to move money around. Kick them out of the the dollar payment system, did a long list of things. Can't trade Russian bonds, can't receive, can't send, etc. Well, the other day, the Central Bank of Russia paid dollar interest on their external dollar-denominated bonds. And everyone's like, wait a second, I thought we had sanctions. I thought we kicked them out of the system. Here, Russia's paying, now they have about $150 billion of external dollar-denominated debt. They had a big payment coming up, interest payment, and they paid it. Like, how did that work? Well, two things. Number one, people, you got to read, I've actually read all these sanctions. There's a couple hundred pages at this point. But in the fine print, a lot of these things have delayed effective dates. They were issued in late February, early March, but they had 30, 60, or 90-day delays in the effective date, depending on the sanction. So most of them aren't even in place yet, number one. Number two, somebody at the Treasury finally woke up and said, well, wait a second. If we tell Russia they can't pay the debt, who loses from that? They keep the money, and our bondholders, it's American bondholders who lose money. It's the creditor who loses out when the debtor can't pay. Where are those bonds? Well, you'd be surprised. A lot of them are in BlackRock. They could be in someone's 401k. Like, I didn't buy any Russian bonds. Well, did you buy an emerging market ETF from Morgan Stanley? Because there could be some Russian bonds in there. I mean, take a look. But my point is, this is where, when I made the comment, what happens in Russia doesn't stay in Russia. When you tell the Russians that they can't pay their debt, and so debt starts defaulting all over the world, you don't know where it's going to pop up. But you're now playing, this is why I use the nuclear war analogy, you're playing with a global liquidity crisis. Because that's how these things can evolve very quickly, as we saw in 2008 and 1998.
There's also now, in terms of more sanctions, proposed legislation in the U.S. Senate to freeze gold reserves held by the Central Bank of Russia. But you say, good luck with that. Because that is one question that I was thinking, like, why wouldn't Russia, or would they sell some of their gold to get out of this mess?
Well, the only way to freeze gold reserves, we're talking about physical bullion, by the way, that they have in Russia. Apparently some of it's outside of Russia. I don't know exactly how much, but some of it it's foolish to leave your gold with the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England, because that's just, might as well just sign it over to the exchequer. But most of it's in Russia, but some of it is not. But the only way to freeze the physical bullion in Russia is to leave it out in the cold, because that's the beauty of physical bullion, which is it's not digital, it's not in some account, and you can't freeze it. Now, what they did, just to be a little bit technical, Daniela, the pending legislation says, well, yeah, we can't actually seize the gold without sending the 101st Airborne into Moscow, which, of course, we're not going to do. But if you sell the gold, we're going to freeze the proceeds. So it immobilizes the gold. It's actually what Goldfinger was doing in that old James Bond movie from 1964. Everyone, at least in the movie version, everyone thought Goldfinger was going to like take the gold out of Fort Knox. That was not the plan. The plan was to make it radioactive so it couldn't be used, and then that way he could corner the market. So what we're saying is, if you sell the gold, we're going to seize the proceeds, so therefore you can't sell it, therefore it's no good to you. That has some impact, but it's not exactly true, and here's why. You can put that gold on a plane, fly it to China, and unload it in a secure PLA Air Force or Air Wing base in China, and use it to pay for whatever you want. So you can. It's either barter, or if you want to say gold is money, which is how I look at it, it's just delivering the cash in gold form.
So getting back to the point about this, Russia, China teaming up, I mean, or other countries now looking outside of the U.S. We already see it with Saudi Arabia in discussions to start using the Chinese yuan. What's the next step? Let's talk about, does this fast track the digitalization of coins coming down the road here, Jim?
Well, yeah, I mean, I point out that the dollar has been a cryptocurrency since at least 1979. That was the last year the Treasury issued a paper Treasury note, like you had a note. Maybe somebody's grandmother still has an old one in the attic, but they had little, almost like stamps, like you peel off a coupon and take it down to the bank and get paid. That the last time they did that was 1979. So the dollar has been digital, and message traffic has been encrypted since around 1980. But I think in terms of the impact on the dollar, this is be careful what you wish for, and this was exactly what I was saying earlier in terms of second and third order effects. And I warned the Pentagon about this, and I warned the Treasury about this because I know how economic sanctions work. I've been very involved in that from the point of view of the intelligence community and also advising the government. But they can be powerful, but if you use them too much and too broadly, they actually lose all their impact because the people you're targeting say, well, okay, no mas, I'm out of the dollar system. You've done it one too many times, and this is an example of that. We've never frozen a central bank before. We have now. We've never kicked an entire country out of SWIFT, with the exception of Iran, but that's a much more isolated case. We have now with Russia, and so instead of just sitting there saying, "Oh, gee, you got me," they can say, "Okay, let's go to a new payment system. Let's pick up a new currency." The Saudis are saying the same thing, and all of a sudden, if you're one of the top princes of Saudi Arabia, maybe Mohammed bin Salman or any of the top princes, you have a yacht in Monaco, you have a house in Aspen, you have who knows how many houses and palaces and yachts around the world, private jets, and they're like, hey, actually, all that stuff could be seized, because that's what we're doing to the Russian oligarchs. And by the way, it's not limited to oligarchs. We saw this kind of neo-fascism in Canada very recently with Chrystia Freeland, who's the deputy prime minister, freezing the bank accounts and the crypto wallets of the truckers. Now, these are blue-collar, nonviolent protesters. Yeah, they were blocking traffic.
Or anyone who supported the truckers. Yeah.
Sorry?
Or anyone who supported the truckers.
Anyone who well, actually, Canada went so far as to criminalize it. If you supported the truckers under a recent interpretation of Canadian law through Chrystia Freeland, the deputy prime minister, that's a criminal act. So I told Justin, I said, come and get me. But my point being, so she's seizing the accounts of blue collar truck drivers, and Biden's seizing the accounts of oligarchs, but it's the same thing. Okay, blue collar, multi-billionaire, but it's the same thing. Suddenly, Canada and the U.S., two of the number one, I think number 5 economy in the world, number 6 maybe, have frozen Canadian dollar and U.S. dollar accounts of people they don't like. Now, you can say it's for good reason, and Putin should have invaded Ukraine. I get it, but if you're a Saudi prince, if you're certainly a Russian, if you're a Chinese oligarch, how comfortable are you with the dollar right now? I'm going to suggest the answer is not very.
And this is why so many investors out there are now scrambling, perhaps, to look for alternatives outside of their, current Canadian or U.S. Banking system. But back to the point, and I had asked this to another expert, and help me understand this. The U.S. administration must have understood the repercussions of this. So why would they do anything that would risk the U.S. dollar losing its reserve currency status?
Because they didn't understand it. Now, you would think they would. You would think, but there's the number 2 guy at the Treasury, it's Wally something. He's the sanctions guy. He's on point. I don't know if he's a deputy secretary of the Treasury, but he's a senior official in the Treasury, and he's on point for the sanctions. I haven't met him personally, by the way, but I checked him out. Looks like a thoroughly bright guy, but other than carrying Larry Fink's briefcase for a few months, I mean, he's a year maybe, he's never had a job outside of academia or government. So he doesn't really understand the real world and doesn't understand what we're discussing right now. So the answer to the question, Danielle, is that they didn't think this through. They don't understand these knock-on effects. They don't understand how the international monetary system actually works. They don't understand the blowback. I mean, I'll give you another example. This one has received some publicity. So we throw all kinds of sanctions on Russia. So Russia said, okay, we're going to stop our exports, Russian exports of strategic metals and chemicals and other elements that everyone else needs for inputs in their manufacturing processes. And they put a ban on exports of nickel. Well, okay, so you need nickel to make batteries, so good luck with your electric vehicles. Okay, so U.S. throws sanctions on Russia. Russia retaliates by banning nickel exports. The price of nickel goes to the moon. It went up by a factor of 4 or 5. That's really not surprising. London Metal Exchange fell down. They had to close.
Yeah.
Okay, but who lost? there was a Chinese billionaire who owns one of the largest nickel uh, mining operations in the world, who lost, I think, $5 or $6 billion. So here's Russia and the U.S. fighting an economic war, and the loser pops up in China. That wasn't
Yep.
on his radar screen, and that wasn't on anybody else's radar screen. But it's a good example where the damage shows up in when you don't expect it.
And you brought up chapters 1 and 2 from Currency Wars, where you basically highlight this scenario. You said the scenario you presented at the time was that Russia and China would accumulate large gold reserves, pool their gold, and launch a new digital currency backed by gold in the place of the US dollar. Is that the form it would take for you, something backed by gold?
Probably, and here's why. And by the way, when I wrote that, and when we did the war game, and when I wrote that, Russia had about 600 tons of gold, and today they have 2,300 tons. China had about 600 tons of gold, and today they have about 2,000 tons, just slightly less, that we know of. And they may have several thousand tons off the books in the State Administration of Foreign Exchange that we don't know about, because that's completely opaque. So Russia and China did exactly what we warned the Pentagon about in 2009, exactly, which is increase their gold reserves by a factor of 4 or more. Um, so, but everyone's like, well, the Chinese yuan is going to be the global reserve currency. No, it's not going to be the ruble. But here's why. Well, there are a lot of reasons, but the main reason is when you talk about reserve currency, you have to understand what that means. It's not like the People's Bank of China has a bunch of $100 bills on pallets stacked up in the basement. When people say reserve currency, what they really mean is the currency of the bonds that they invest in. In other words, they're dollar-denominated assets in the form of treasury bonds or notes. That's what China actually has on their books, not like dollars per se. So if you want to suggest or hypothesize that the Chinese yuan is going to replace the US dollar as a global reserve currency, where's the yuan bond market? I mean, it doesn't exist. Very small scale, very illiquid, no primary dealers, no when issue trading, no auctions, no repo, no settlement clearance, none of the plumbing and the mechanics of a mature bond market such as the United States. And above all, they don't have a rule of law. I mean, at least if somebody reneges on a treasury bond, you can sue somebody, but you can't do that in China. So the absence of the rule of law, number one, the absence of the infrastructure, the plumbing, for want of a better word, are two reasons why the yuan and certainly the ruble will not replace the dollar as a reserve currency. However, what I was hypothesizing then, and I'd come back to this, is you can create a brand new currency that does have all that stuff. And in my example, they used a Swiss bank, UK law, put the gold in a third-party depository. If you wanted some of the new currency, you could deposit your own gold and get some of the currency or trade with them or run a surplus. So it was a replacement system, but you would need the gold to instill confidence. But they don't. They don't have bond markets, so they're not going to have them soon. So the yuan and the ruble aren't going to replace anything.
I guess to wrap part 1 of this very thorough discussion, I want to get back to really the main point you're hammering home here, is that we're on the verge of a global liquidity crisis. How does that domino effect play out? How far are we from this really erupting to that global crisis, Jim? Does it happen exponentially from here? Does it take a few years? Where are we at?
It's more the former. We are uncomfortably close. Now it's impossible to know exactly how close because it's a complex dynamic system, and you can make very good predictions on complex dynamic systems as to the magnitude of the crisis, but it's very hard to get the exact timing. But because you never know what thing is going to trigger it. But I can say that we're uncomfortable because now we've been there twice before in recent years. 1998. We came within hours of shutting every market in the world. Began with a Russian default, by the way. August 17th, 1998, Russia defaulted on their external debt, and the ruble was grossly devalued. That started a global liquidity crisis, went around the world, ended up in my lap at Long-Term Capital Management, where we had $1.4 trillion of derivatives. And everyone goes, oh, long-term capital, you guys lost a lot of money in Russia. We didn't. We lost maybe $100 million in Russia, but we lost closer to $4 billion on everything else. because in a liquidity crisis, people sell everything. It's not a question of do you have Russian bonds. It's like no, they sell everything. Spreads widen, not enough collateral, margin calls, people being blown out of their positions. That's what a global financial crisis looks like. We cured that with a $4 billion all cash injection sponsored by the Federal Reserve and two rate cuts, one on an emergency basis by Alan Greenspan. We got through that, but we came within hours of shutting every market in the world. Same thing in 2008. We all know, September 15, 2008, Lehman Brothers. Okay. People don't realize that, Morgan Stanley was days away from failing. Goldman Sachs was days away from failing. John Mack said so at the time. Lehman was begging for help. He said, "Sorry, I got enough on my plate. We're worried about Morgan Stanley right now." And then the Fed came in, and so think of it as dominoes are falling. So all the dominoes are falling, and they're going to keep falling unless you truncate it, drop a wall in, and that wall was the Fed. But here's my point: each bailout gets bigger than the one before. Each crisis is more dangerous than the one before. So 1998, 2008, here we are in 2022. We're going to get to a point, we may be there, where the crisis is actually bigger than the Fed, bigger than the Fed's ability to stop.
And I guess finally, to just bring this home, given the terrifying picture you've just painted, Jim, how should we be protecting ourselves here?
Well, you want assets that are going to be immune from a global liquidity crisis. What are they? Land, real estate, gold, silver, fine art. I see Andy Warhol, Marilyn Monroe has gone. They estimate $200 million. You could have bought that for 50,000 in the 1970s. That's a little more specialized, but there are natural resources, water, etc., energy, oil. If you want to be in stocks, okay, get stocks of companies that are based on natural resources, such as ExxonMobil, Chevron. I mean, I'm just giving these as an example, but so there are a lot of ways to protect yourself, but a regular stock portfolio is not a good one, and banks are going to be in distress, money market funds are going to be in distress. That's what a liquidity crisis is.
Jim Rickards, thank you so much for your thoughts on Russia, Ukraine, and the repercussions that we will unfortunately have to suffer. So thank you for your thoughts.
Thanks.